Hello, everyone, and welcome to Inspire Me Forward, episode 5, take 2. We are so happy that you're here today or you are listening to this in the future. And welcome to our panel discussion on death, dying, and grief. I originally did not have anybody to come into the spot for March 7th. I was concerned, and of course, Universe had another idea. It said, well, why don't we do this? And we have 3 beautiful, beautiful souls that are joining us today that have so much wisdom, and their herd has so much wisdom on this. And I just look forward to the conversation. It's a little bit agendaed and it's a little bit organic, and we will take it from there. I would like to just take a moment to put our hands on our hearts and just honor those that maybe are passing, and those that have passed, and those that we are grieving for, or those that we know that are in the grief process. Just take a moment just to honor them, hold space for them energetically, and let them be part of this call and part of this wisdom that's coming forth. Thank you. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our guests today. So we have George Brauneis from Colorado, Kim Hallin from South Carolina, and Greta Matos from Patagonia. And I'm gonna just jump in here and get our folks here to just share a little bit about themselves. Just do a quick introduction, and then we'll dive right into the deep stuff. So Greta, if I could get you to share yourself.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Greta Matos, and I'm arriving with you all today from Patagonia, Chile, where I live with as guardian of a herd of 6. Now 6, originally 7, 2 of whom are now in my spirit herd, have joined our spirit herd, and another one has joined the existing herd since the passing of our other 2. And I grew up with horses in Pennsylvania, and so they have always lived as a companion with me. And actually my first encounter with the death of the most beloved being I'd ever known was as a child, and it was a horse. And so I've walked with a lot of horses across the threshold of death and dying in different ways, and also have brought it into my own life and the way that I live in relationship with grief, death, and dying in human and animal and earth realms too. So I'm grateful, so grateful to be in this space with all of you and to be able to share a little bit of what I've encountered and to hear from everyone as well. So thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Greta. I'm so glad you're here, and so glad you're here with that beautiful scenery behind you. I know I always take a wonderful deep breath when I see where you are. And let's go to George.
Hi, and I'm George Brauneis, and I'm out here, and I always like to say I'm a half mile south of the middle of nowhere, because there's actually a street a half mile north of here that is nowhere is the name of the street. So out here in Eckerd, Colorado, and it is very remote. I'm in wild horse country. I've got 3 of our horse ranges north of me and 1 horse range south of me. So I am definitely in wild horse country. I am owned by 24 wild horses, from domesticated to wild to semi-domesticated. And I used to like to say I'm a caregiver or guardian or whatever, but no, they just pretty much own me. I have dedicated this ranch to the wild horses, and it's been operating ranch since 2017. So that 7 years. And I've had to there are 2 horses here that are buried that have passed while here. So I've probably had well over 100 horses come and go from here, and I do have my core herd of about 10. Behind me is Clancy and Zeus, two of my lead geldings. Two of my three lead geldings are here with me. I've got three of my lead mares are in here as well. So we'll see who comes forward to share. But I had been custodian and caregiver for both my parents as they went through their aging process through their final years. I was damned if I was going to put them in a nursing home. So I did everything I could to keep them comfortable at home and allow them to age as gracefully as possible. And that is quite the experience. It's an adventure. If you haven't been through it, you really don't understand it. Those that have been through it, I understand it. I get it. Those that may be going through it, I can help. Grief doesn't start the day someone or an animal dies. Grief is part of the aging process. And so that might talk about that. But the horses that have crossed over here, both of them were untimely, two horses in their prime. They were healthy as a horse. When I went to bed, I woke up the next morning and they were dead. No signs of colic, no nothing. They just laid down and crossed over. So I will probably touch more on the untimely death of someone in their prime and leave the horse that's going through the dying process of maybe a 30-year-old horse that you had a lifetime with to someone else.
Okay. Great. Thank you, George. And thank you to your herd for being there as well. And Kim, let's check in with you.
Yeah. Hi, I'm so glad to be here. Thank you. I'm Kim Hallin, and I am the owner and operator of a nature-based experiential learning program outside of Charleston, South Carolina. And I wish that my Wi-Fi would allow me to be outside. It's a beautiful day here. This is my farm behind me, but you're missing the spring flowers and colors that are outside. But my Wi-Fi just doesn't reach that far out here. So I currently live here with 3 horses still with me in embodied form in my herd. And I also have 3 of our former herd members who are buried here on the farm. So they're here still with me in spirit. And my journey with death and dying and grief with horses has evolved a lot over the years. I was involved in equine rescue work for a long time, where I did work with severely neglected and abused horses, and went from kind of really a perspective that euthanasia is sometimes just like the kindest thing that we can do for a horse that's had a lot of suffering and isn't going to be able to recover from that, or from the perspective of being, a caretaker and it being our responsibility to make decisions and to know when to make those decisions. That's still part of it. But it's been interesting that each of the experiences with my own personal horses has really taken me into a deeper understanding that death for horses or humans or anyone is a very individual and very spiritual process, and it is a sacred process. And so I've been blessed to have the opportunity to walk that in more personal ways with some of my herd. And of the 3 that I've had that have died here, one was he was actually a rescued horse, very elderly, had a lot of internal damage from his neglect, but he was actually struck by lightning here on my farm. So it was a very sudden and unexpected, even though he was elderly and had a lot of health issues. Another one was my herd elder, who I had lived with for many, many, many years, who I walked that sort of path of more like hospice with him as he aged and passed at 32. And then a year later, I had another horse who came to me into my care, into my herd, with pretty advanced equine melanocytoma. I'm not even sure I'm saying that correctly, but the gray horses that get the melanoma type tumors, they were not cancerous, but they can grow rapidly. And so he died from complications of that. And so 3 very different kinds of situations. And I'll kind of see which one I highlight on based on how these stories go. But it's been a beautiful learning and unfolding for me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You talked about rescue, and I said the first horse, when we had our farm, the first horse that was given to us had to be put down the next day. It was given to us because a human didn't want to go through the process and didn't want to share in that process with the horse. So it was really eye-opening for us. This was many years ago, but yeah, interesting. Thank you all for sharing in all of that and introducing yourselves. Let's start with, just as Kim sort of alluded to here, just your equine experience, your experience with death and dying and grief, how that came in and within your herd. I know you've all dealt with it in different ways and dealt with it in different situations. So I'm going to just give you each the floor for a few minutes, and perhaps you could share one of those situations that speaks to you. So again, we're going to keep this going the same way. So Greta, we'll go back to you.
Okay, thanks. Oh, yeah. Each and every one that I have had the privilege to be with in the dying process was so different, and as Kim said, so individual. And I think I'll share about the most recent loss that I had of a dear partner and companion named Picante, who carried me 1,000 miles across some of the most remote and wild landscapes that exist on the earth. And then was the elder of our herd for the last 6 years. Until he died for 6 years. And he was such an essence of calm and kind of that wise elderhood. And his dying was a slow journey. He was old by the time that he passed, but he had spent the year before he died, he actually hospiced another horse in my herd who was also an elder. And that was one of the most remarkable experiences that I'd ever witnessed, because I lived with horses, alongside horses for almost my whole life, since I was 3. And here in Patagonia, in Chile, we live with them in the earth elements. They live completely naturally out in the mountains. And so we live in the rhythm of nature. And Picante, when one of the horses, his name was Harimau, he was in a process of dying, Picante actually connected with him, and he'd never had before. And so I witnessed this entire change in relationship in the herd that was radical and very different. And he walked with Harimau for the last 8 months of Harimau's life. And then after Harimau passed, I felt Picante's own shift. And something that George, you mentioned, kind of, when I knew Picante was dying, I had to actively process the level of grief that was welling up in me, because I was living beside him and he still had his spirit very light, and he was still very, very present. He was very wholly here until he was gone. But I knew he was going, and so I couldn't deny it, and I couldn't pretend it wasn't happening. And the only way to honor his walk and enjoy our time together was to be able to also process all of the deep, deep grief I had, knowing that he was going soon. And he died in the mountains, and we had to bury him by hand, which is very, very intense. It took us 3 days, just my husband and I and my daughter. She was a year old. And it was such a difficult but also physical process to bury him. That also was this grieving that I feel that we don't have a lot of access to in most of our societies now, because we don't work with death like we used to. We used to actually touch the bodies of our dead family members and community members. We used to wash them, we used to bury them, dig their graves, and we don't really do that very often in most of our cultures, and so we're often removed from that. And I grew up on a farm, so I grew up with death very close, but we had machines in the US, and so when we had a horse die, we could dig a hole with a machine. But to have to bury Picante with our hands over the course of 3 days, so we had to sleep by his body and the herd, somehow it changed the way that I could be with him passing, because after he was in the ground, I felt so much this clarity that he was in everything. Like it was, I could feel him in my body then. And the night that we finally had him fully buried, it was night by then. And we went and we sat in the field where the rest of the herd was grazing. And we were waiting for it was a full moon. We were waiting for the moon to come up. And I swear to God, and if Hallin, my husband, wasn't there next to me, then maybe I would think I had imagined it, but I couldn't because he was there. As the moon was rising, this massive white cloud was on the other side of the valley overlooking us, like above our shoulder. And it was the perfect shape, and it was massive. It was the perfect shape of Picante's face, like a spitting image, and he had a very distinct face. So it wasn't even just like, it kind of looked like a horse. No, it was him. And it appeared over us in the sky, illuminated by the full moon that was rising over the mountain. And again, it was just being still to feel the essence of the sacredness of our relationship. Like to be in relationship with one another when we're alive and when we're dead. That there's an intactness that remains. And that was so incredible for me, and I still feel it so deeply in my body, like that feeling of him arriving again, even though again he had just left, but he came in another shape then, and like reaffirmed, yeah, you feel me everywhere, I really am. And amazingly, the day before I found him, because we found him, he'd already died. The day before, I had a dream about my very first beloved Tusaks, my horse who had passed, and she was the one that took me as a child across the threshold of death. And when she died, it was sudden, it was a colic. I walked her for 18 hours before she died. She died in my lap, and I was 12. And I felt such deep grief. I've never felt it since, but I felt like I couldn't ever smile again. Like I felt that level of grief. The day before I found Picante, Tusaks came to my dreams. She was in my dream. So again, I think this translates to every relationship that we experience in our lives, that we can feel that level of interconnection and interweaving, but we have to make space to go slowly and to feel it. You know, we have to be there. Because if we numb ourselves or we disconnect, it will be there, but we won't feel it. And then we can tell ourselves it's not real. But when we're there for it, you can't deny how real it is.
So true. Thank you, Greta. I find myself smiling, which seems foreign and seems odd, but I think it's a smiling of familiarity. And yes, I've felt that, and that interconnectedness between all of us here and nature and everything. It just, the way you've expressed it, I find myself sort of smiling with my heart. So thank you. Thank you for sharing that. and a breath, everyone. George, over to you. Thank you, Greta.
Yeah, it's definitely death and dying and grief. A lot of it has to do with how comfortable we are with our own life, how comfortable we are with, you know, are we comfortable, like Greta was saying, being closer and dearer with nature, or are we in a place that's a confine that's very what's the word, sterile, like people die that they're in a hospital and it's a very sterile environment, whereas you die out here in the, you got mountains overhead, you've got birds flying overhead, you've got the sun, you got the clouds, you got the wind. It's a definitely a more natural way to pass. It's a more natural way to live. We've become so sterile in modern society. I mean, just turn on the TV. You got to buy the cleaner that kills 99.999% of all bacteria. But watch out for that 0.001% that doesn't kill. So I'd rather just be covered in the stuff and let my immunity deal with it. But I found, and I'm just going to start lighthearted and then I'll go deep. But when we're born, we're born, we learn to walk, we learn to play, and then we go to everybody's birthday parties. And we grow up and we go to birthday parties, and then that shifts in middle school, high school, and then we go to prom and homecoming and all the dances and all the games and all the social events. And then we get out of high school and we might go to college or trade school or something, and then everything shifts to going to weddings. Oh my God. It's like every other week you're going to somebody's wedding. And it's just this big upswell of life as you're growing, and you shift from, the birthday parties to the proms to weddings, and then it's weddings, and then everybody that got married, now they're having children, so you're back into birthday parties and weddings and birthday parties. And then your parents start to age, and then it shifts. All of a sudden you start going to funerals more than you go to weddings, and then all of a sudden it's like, I got my first wedding invitation in probably 5 years, like 2 days ago. I about fell out of my seat. I'm like, a wedding? What? So I'm like, yes, I'm going. But there's that natural transition of, you're expected these things, and we're all expected life expectancy 75 years plus, and then we grow old and we pass away. A horse is 30 years plus, 28 to 30 plus years, and we expect them to grow old and then finally pass away. But when you lose a horse that's 10 years old in their prime, that has had no indications of any health issues, nothing, completely healthy, completely integrated with the herd, and to just come out one morning and you're like, uh-oh. Those hit hard. There's no preparation. How do you, I've got an old black mare out there that she just keeps on going, but she's got the scarsoma, whatever cancer, and she has lesions that open up, and I put a special ointment on to help them close back up. And there's only so much you can do for her, but it's just, for her, it was her that I came out in the morning and she had passed. I'd be like, okay, she had a good life. I gave her a good life. She was happy in the herd. But yeah, to lose a 10-year-old horse that was in his prime, those are hard. On the flip side, he went on his terms. There was no fiddling around by humans trying to extend his life or what have you. It was his time. He probably had a heart attack or a stroke, aneurysm, something, and he was done. There was no signs of thrashing around or anything. It was not colic, wasn't twisted gut or anything like that. He just passed. Now, in passing, I will say one thing about horses. whether it be living or dying, they do not want to live alone. They do not want to die alone. They want to die and live with at least one other horse, with at least one companion, at least a friend. And, you know, my heart goes out for all those horses that are in a 10 by 20 stall and they get an hour of turnout and they literally do not have contact with another horse. And that's, again, that's the reality of 21st century America. But for the horses here that are a part of the herd, can you pop that herd sign up or graphic?
It's coming.
Okay.
Oh, 1 second here. Might be a second. There we go. Oh. There you are.
Okay,
It's up.
I just see a little thumbnail. Is it up? Okay.
Yep.
So if everybody sees that, good. So this originated in some of the heart math stuff. What it shows is the bioelectric fields of each horse, and
I
then
just see 4 images and they're small thumbnails.
is it? Yeah,
Oh,
that's
they didn't
kind
come
of
up. All right, hold
yeah.
on 1 second. I'm not sure if I can get it up then because I can't minimize it when we're in recording. So what I can do is pop it into the chat.
Perfect,
Okay,
and
so
people can.
yeah, they can open it.
Excellent. Okay, so it's as close a visual as I found, and I'd love to give credit to whoever did the artwork. But it's just kind of floating around on the internet now. So if I knew who did it, I would like shout out accolades.
There you go.
But it shows each horse has their bioelectric field, and then as the herd grows, the herd has a bioelectric field. And this is what can be measured scientifically. So we know that our ability to measure things is just a fraction of what's really out there. And as like Greta was saying, it felt like when her horse passed, he was still with the herd. He was still with her. And energy never, there's always the same amount of energy. It changes forms. So we're going from a bioelectric energy to a purely atmospheric electrical energy. But I'm convinced that when a horse passes within a herd, the horse passes through the herd, and the herd comes up. Almost every single horse comes up and gives their last regards to the horse that's down, that's passed. But I am convinced that that horse, part of their spirit is shared with every horse in the herd, shared with those humans that are around, and a part of that imprints within our DNA or within our very soul. And can I prove it? No. Have I seen enough evidence to say that that happens? Yes. Because there's times since Quigley passed that I see his mannerisms and characters within 3 or 4 other horses in the herd that wasn't there before. And it's just like, and the one horse that's out there, his name's Butch. He's almost a carbon copy of Quigley, just a smaller, younger version. But the mannerisms from Quigley are more implanted in Butch than anyone else in the herd. But I've seen a lot of Quigley's characteristics and his essence still are here in the herd. And so there is a passing, there's something going to the great beyond, and I really wanted to share that rainbow picture because most people think of a rainbow as an arch. I look at not a rainbow bridge, but a rainbow gateway, a complete 360. And we're on this side of the gateway, and then we pass, but we still leave some behind. And then we probably pull a lot with us. I'm convinced that the horse that passes brings part of the herd with them into the hereafter. So it's one of the most beautiful rainbow pictures I've ever seen in my life. So I hope that gets out to everybody, because a rainbow isn't 180. A rainbow is a 360-degree, and it can be spherical or a gateway. And so if I go back to the grieving of the sudden grieving, the unprepared grieving, it's shock for us humans. I think it's 3 days of shock and disbelief and whatever before you even come to the point of going, okay, he has passed and he has moved forward. But there's those memories, those hoof prints. They're still an essence of that horse within us. I think every animal that I've ever cared for that's passed on, they leave a little bit behind. And I send a little bit of me with them. So it's a trade. It's not a give and take, it's a blend. And so much of life isn't a give and take. It isn't a loss or a gain or a fresh pile of poop. It's just a blending. And it can be just a little bit, 1 or 2%. It's like making the perfect milkshake. It's mostly milk and a little bit of chocolate. You don't want 8 ounces of milk and 8 ounces of chocolate. It would be overwhelming. But when you get that blend where you have a little your essence blended in with the essence of those around you, it's just becomes a beautiful thing. And I just am, after being embedded with this herd for over 7 years, as it's grown and changed and shifted, there is more life in the whole of the herd than there is in, it's the old saying, the sum is greater than the parts. The herd is greater than the horses. They all contribute and then all become something greater. And for the 2 horses that have passed in the 7 years here, it hurts, but it's part of life too. I mean, we all have an expiration date. Nobody lives forever. And we've got to do our thing and share what we can. Hopefully leave a little bit of a legacy behind, and then make room for the next generation or the next 2 generations or whatever come forward. But I definitely believe the day I pass I'll leave a little bit behind with everybody that I love and everybody that's loved me, and off I'll go on to my next adventure. And where that is, I have no idea. But I know there's going to be a next adventure. I've just seen too much evidence to deny that there won't be. And so that alone, I think, gives you a different perspective on death. When you know death isn't the end, it's just the beginning of a new chapter. It's just, I'm not going to go jump out in front of a bus because I know I have a next chapter. It's like, no, this chapter's got to play out, and then we'll move on to the next chapter. But I guess that's kind of it. But the grief for me, as I have moved through more death of my parents, death of a couple of good friends, number of deaths of horses and dogs and what have you, the more I experience death, the grieving has really shifted. And instead of a great and profound loss, to a like, oh, okay. The time was wonderful, and it's time to move on. I mean, it's just like, it's not a whole lot different for me anymore than, last time I saw a friend was 20 years ago. They're still alive, but they're not a part of my life. They've moved on. And so in many ways, it's like, okay, it's death. The physical body is gone. Physical body isn't working anymore, but they're still alive in a different form. I don't know exactly what that form is, but they've just moved on.
Hmm. Thank you, George.
Yeah.
That's some great, yeah. I love your I'll say imagery for me is just that leaving something behind, but they're taking something. It's a two-way street, for want of a better word, but it's a blending, like you say, and I love that. That's so beautiful. That really is so beautiful, that it's not just one thing. It's a mixture, and how I guess it goes back to Greta's interconnectedness and ties in with that. So, oh, thank you for sharing that. Thank you. Kim, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Greta, and thank you, George. I could relate to so much of what you both said, and hearing your stories deepens some of my experiences as well. I'm going to go a little esoteric, I think. And I kind of knew I would, because Markus was speaking to me about it being his story. And even after hearing you two, I still think this maybe is a different, a little bit different perspective on a lot of the same things that you've both already spoken to. Markus was there's many cultures that believe horses sort of walk and play in that space between the realms, right? That they're kind of in touch with both. And if I have ever known a horse that I felt confident was in that space, it was Markus. And he first came to me in a journey, as a vision, about a year before he came into my life. And Markus came into my life later in his life and later in my life. He was only in my life for about 4 years. He was, I think, 14 which isn't that old for a horse, but so Markus was a very, very large, warm blood cross gray from a long lineage of gray sport horses, performance horses, jumpers. So he was 18 hands tall. He was a huge horse, just a gentle giant. And he had always been loved. So this is very interesting. But I knew the minute I met him in person, when I met him in my journey, he was just vibrant and powerful and graceful and loving energy. And then when I met him in person, even though I knew it was him, it was like he was a shell of himself. And there was a deep, deep sadness in Markus. As I mentioned before, he had melanocytoma tumors. And this is why he ended up with me. It's just a sad reality in a lot of the world, especially show world, that once a horse isn't rideable anymore, still a lot of years potentially with a 14-year-old horse to continue to care for it. His owner loved him, but due to a lot of reasons in her life, she couldn't keep him. He had been a show horse. And so, like George mentioned, feeling sorry for those horses that live in a stall. As a then white horse, show horse, he had spent most of his time in stalls or in private turnout, a lot of show barns. They don't turn horses out with other horses. I found out later from the person who bred him that he stayed with his home where he was bred till he was at about 2, and he was very much a mama's boy, as they said, like loved his mother. So that separation, I'm sure, was traumatic when it happened. Then he had a very stable home, but again, a show home, and he had a lot of health issues, according to his past owner, not just the melanocytoma tumors. He had a club foot. He had a lot of allergies and respiratory issues, and just a lot of things, probably partly from living in barns mostly. But he never really learned how to be a horse. So Markus was amazing with people, loved people, was in his element with people, had no idea how to be a horse in a herd. So when he came to me, that was one of the things I said. I was kind of a last resort for her, because she had tried him several places, and he kept, as big as he was, he's always getting beaten up by other horses. And I didn't know how that was going to go here. And that played out initially the same way here. And then I have a whole nother story I could tell you about how a member of my herd stepped up and mentored him and showed him all it was about was that he didn't know how to not get caught in the corners. And if he could figure out how to get out of the corners and not get caught, then he figured it out. And it was beautiful to watch him over the 4 years start to figure out how to be a horse and to have these horse relationships. And he and my herd elder Shoki, who passed a year before him, became very, very dear friends. It was beautiful to see the friendships he developed with my geldings, both of my geldings. But from the beginning, it was so interesting. I'm not an animal communicator. I'm intuitive. But Markus is the first horse that I actually, I had experiences of, I received messages from him. And it was crazy a little bit for me at first. And one of the things that he told me early on, because I was very convinced, even though his tumors were pretty far advanced when he came to me already, I wanted to do everything I could, of course, to try to see if I could treat them or help them. It was beyond, well beyond anything that could be surgically addressed at that point. He had lots of them in different places. And I was talking to him about this one day, and I heard him basically say, it really doesn't matter, you know, what you do to try to treat my tumors, because he had decided that he was going to, well, so let me just go back. One of his tumors, one of the large ones, was in his intestine. It was reachable when that could do an exam, so we knew it was there. And so I was always on kind of colic watch for him, or what would happen if that got too big, if he wouldn't be able to pass manure. And basically what he said, though, was, I already know how I'm going to go, and it's going to be colic, and that's what I've chosen, and the tumors are going to help me do that. And I didn't tell anybody, because I was like, this is crazy. First of all, it's crazy. Second of all, I don't want to believe that he wants to go that way. Like, that's not going to be a fun death, right? That's not going to be an easy death. So I tucked it away in the back of my head, but yet everything I tried with treating the tumors, nothing seemed to stop the progression. And so I knew he was not going to make it to an old age. And the other thing that came through to him while he was living several times was, I kept getting this message from him that he was from regal lineage, and that he was heartbroken because he didn't know his family members. He was, when I did do research later, he was the grandson of a very famous gray racehorse, sport horse that now became a very big breeding horse for sport horses. He has thousands of siblings around the world. And he knew this. And it was very sad for him that he didn't know his family, that he never met his father, but he seemed to know who his father was. And he missed his mother, and he missed his other siblings. And so there was this brokenheartedness in him that wasn't just about maybe in a way being rejected by the human family that had cared for him, but also that he, as a domestic horse, he was very disillusioned with his life as a domestic horse, and that he didn't really get to live, in his mind. Herds, they know each other, they know who's related to who, they know the lineages in wild herds. There's stallions, there's lineages there, and he was connected with this. So this was all very confusing for me with this domestic horse. I was getting all these messages, and I was like, I want to honor what you're feeling, right? But the reason that he wanted to go by colic was because that's how his parents, that's what I got. And I later did research this and found that both of his parents did die of colic. And to him, and this is where I really learned to honor that death is a very personal process and a spiritual in some ways. And for him, this will make me cry, experiencing death in a similar way that his parents did made him feel like he was connected to them. It was important to him. He wanted to experience what they had experienced in their passing. So it wasn't until after his death that I really did the research to dig up everything I could find about when it actually did play out this way. And I found that what he had told me was true. So I made a couple notes. I want to check in on this to see what I really wanted to. Yeah. So for me, the hardest part about walking that path with Markus was knowing that I wasn't going to have any control over when this happened, right? And there really wasn't anything I could do, and it could happen at any time. That was a very hard thing. It's one thing, as George talked about, when you're not expecting it and you wake up and a horse has passed, that's very, very hard. It's also very hard to know that end is coming and how do we walk that path with them. And I've done that too. And then it's a weird thing to know it can happen any time. The horse is ready, but I don't know when it's going to happen. And I don't know if I'm ready. And with Shoki, my herd elder, he had actually prepared the rest of the herd. It was fascinating to watch him prepare them for his passing. I didn't see that in Markus. And I think it's partly because Markus just didn't have that same connection to being a horse in a herd. He hadn't had that. He was more concerned with connecting with his ancestors than he was with how the herd was going to cope with life after his death. So I think, again, this is all very different for every horse. And Marcus's tumors had gotten so big that I was kind of in constant worry that this could happen at any time. I knew it could. But what was interesting, it was the temptation was there to say, I could euthanize him proactively. I could avoid this traumatic colic from happening. But not only had he told me that he needed to have that experience and wanted to have that experience, which was hard to honor, but his everyday life, he was engaged, he was content, there were no signs from him that he was suffering on the outside. Like, there weren't signs. So I couldn't justify doing something like that when he was still enjoying every day he had, learning how to be a horse in a herd. So there were these two things happening. And I went on vacation. I was going to be gone for a week. And I was worried because at the last vet check, the tumor inside that she could feel was the size of a watermelon. How he was still passing manure, and I have no idea. It was amazing what can be inside a horse and us not know it. That was another very big lesson for me about what could be going on inside. But I talked to him before I went. I had a new farm sitter, and I said, she'll be traumatized if you go while I'm gone. And I don't want you to go while I'm gone. I'm not, please. I just asked him, I said, if your time is soon, I hope that it can be after I get back. And it was interesting, but I had that conversation with him. He was fine while I was gone. He was fine the night that I came back. We had a beautiful reunion and exchange and really lovely experience that night. It was fine overnight. The next morning at 10, I had a Zoom call, and I swear he knew exactly so that I didn't intervene when I shouldn't intervene, or to the extent that I could have. I can see the horses out my windows. Everybody was fine when I went into my Zoom meeting in this room that I'm in right now. I was in here for an hour. When I went out and walked into the kitchen and could see out the window, he was already in a very advanced stage of severe colic, sweaty, throwing himself on the ground, traumatic. My instincts kicked in, even though I knew all this preparation, and I called my vet because I could tell it was severe, and maybe I didn't know, is this the end? Is this not the end? So I did call the vet, and then I went out to him, and it took her about 30 minutes to get here. And that was a very, very hard 30 minutes. He was in severe pain, but there were moments within that, and there was still this comfort. I was still getting this message from him that was like, this is what I wanted. I need, like, it was so fascinating to be in the throes of this horrible situation, and still I could see as he was going into shock, even I could see this part of his piece in his eyes that was like, thank you for being here. Thank you for walking here with me. I needed someone to be here with me, but this is what I chose. And my vet did get here before he passed. And vets will do what vets will do. We did pump him up with some pain meds at that point where he was able to stand comfortably for a few minutes. And she wanted to just confirm that it wasn't an impaction colic or something that could be treated. We could tell from his level of pain, it probably wasn't, but it wasn't. But during that brief, it was only for a few minutes that even that level of meds kept him comfortable. But he just put his head to my chest, while he could stand there for a minute. And we had that quiet moment that I think he knew I needed to be able to just have that he's at peace, I'm at peace moment. And I felt like that was a gift to me, that he maybe hung on until she got there, so that we had that really quiet moment. And then we did usher his passing. Well, while he was there with his head at my chest, I asked him, had he experienced enough of that pain, did he know what that experience was? And I got yes from him. So I did, we did help him pass at the very end. I think he would have passed pretty quickly even if we hadn't. But that was his story. And I could also tell a lot of story about how my herd grieved both of these deaths. And I really want to touch on what George said about I think that there's no such thing as a disintegration. We have integration of herds. I don't know that there's any such thing as a disintegration. Had another horse tell me that before. Once we have come together, whether we're humans or horses in a community, and we are family in our hearts, I don't think we ever are unapart again. And there are absolutely pieces of both of my horses, those two horses particularly, that passed in this close-knit herd, and I see them in the other horses. And I also have seen how each of my horses, none of them become who these other horses were, but I've seen them step into roles and mannerisms and just spots in the herd that are empty, and how they find them to fill what was whole before. And they call on these two horses that have passed, I think, to evolve themselves into how to be whole again as a herd. So I'll stop there. That was the story I wanted to share.
Wow, thank you, Kim. You all have such ways of telling stories. I was gonna say here, Kim, perhaps we can put up Shoki's story, and when I do a summary, we can put that up so folks can go and hear that, the one that you did for our summit that once.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, and folks
Because
can hear that
Markus is
one.
part of that story too.
Yeah. So let's put that up too, so people can hear that one. Thank you both. Thank you all. Thank you all for sharing such such wise stories. I mean, they're wise because they, in how painful it was, there's so much wisdom in it. And they taught you all, and you in sharing that teaches all so much. Yes, Pam says profound, and that's the perfect word for it. So I'd like to just, if we have our time's all good, everybody. Good. I'd like to just go a little organic if we can for a minute, and I'll just jump off here. I think we've touched on it, but it just, like I say, we'll take this organically. But the idea of village mindedness, I know in my the preview I did, Stephen Jenkinson, who spent years in palliative care, and just found out what was, he used what wrong with it, but really what was wrong with it, and how can we offer better solutions. And to me, that's where the horses come in, because they can offer better solutions, and nature. But this idea of village mindedness, this idea that if we live as a community, if it's a small community, like you talked, George, with yourself and your parents, that's a community, and the herd is a community. And what can we learn from them? That idea, be it village mindedness, be it community, be it herd, we can call it how we wish to, but I don't know, I'd love to riff on that a little bit. And perhaps in that is that idea of holding space. So I will let anybody take it from there.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind for me with that is, I feel like this maybe goes back to something Greta said too. We don't live and experience death the way that we did once, in a very tangible way. We hide it away a lot in human society, but birth and death are the two things that every living being will experience. And birth, a lot of us don't consciously remember our births, but we are consciously present in many cases for death, or knowing that if it's an age-related death, particularly, even sometimes accidents. I know people who've had near-death experiences and knew that that's what was happening at the time that it's happening. Yeah, and the community. Have you ever? I've seen my horses. I do equine experiential learning, and there are clients I have who were coming when Shoki and Markus were alive, and still come today. And I remember distinctly the first time, one who hadn't been here in like a year or so. She hadn't been here in a long time, but the last time she was there, Markus was alive. And then the next time she came, she had come multiple times, so the herd knew her. The way that my herd approached her, and she came with a heart of knowing that this was going to be hard to be here after Markus had passed, because he was special to her. And the way my herd came right up to her, and it could easily say that maybe they were comforting her, but do you know what I felt from them was they were so happy to see her because she knew Markus. Do you know when someone has passed and you run into someone else who knew them well too and loved them well too, and it feels like this communion of we both know who that person was, that spirit was. That was what it felt like to me. And so I just put that out there, and with a village of it helps us process the loss, and it helps us feel that individual was real when we were with others who also knew and experienced that person or that individual. So that's one aspect.
I think that's true, Kim. And I had a friend whose husband died suddenly from a car wreck. And I can remember to this day sitting on the wall in my front yard. And she said, Pam, you are the only one that says his name. And that meant so much to her that we could talk about her husband, Bob.
Mm-hmm.
And, so I know that's that exact thing,
Yeah.
you knew she knew Markus, and Anne knew I knew Bob, and we could share that. And I was never afraid to talk about him because I knew she needed to talk about him. So I think that's one thing we can do for people if we do it with care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's brilliant, Pam. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, a lot of times there's fear in bringing it up because of fear of others' emotions. So that's really important. Thank you, Pam.
Well, we don't want to be intrusive, we want to.
No.
But we also want to give them the opportunity to share. So
sure, open that space up. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Pam. Appreciate that. And Kim, thank you for sharing that. Greta or George?
Yeah, I just had what came for me was like being able to be fluid in relationship when there's knowledge that there is dying happening, and that the community that's embodied will change. That's something that my herd taught me so much. When Harry Mao passed, and I witnessed his horses who he'd been deeply bonded with disconnect from him fully, and horses that were not ever connected to him, that was Picante, now suddenly come in and companion him. And it was by choice. And again, from the outside looking in, it could seem we can make a lot of judgments and criticisms about why or what's happening. And I think that in our own communities too, when we're in a process of dying, to be able to be companioned and to be able to have others or another that can simply walk with us. And maybe it's not, your longest, oldest friend or your closest family member, but actually that there is this potential that you have another companion that comes in. That's definitely something for me that I hold space in my own life and in my own journey toward my own death, of possibility, that can come in without attachment to who or what, but to this possibility of being companioned toward death in a way that, again, is allowing and not resisting that you're dying and not resisting what is, but actually is able to simply be with you and to care really compassionately without agenda.
And isn't that so so true in when somebody as a human receives a diagnosis, it becomes about prolonging. It doesn't it doesn't become, and that's, I'm not saying there's not, don't do that, but there is this process, and it doesn't always that doesn't always happen. And walking
Mm.
where it's where the death doulas come in and
Mhm.
just being able to walk with them through that. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's so interesting. So interesting. Thank you. George. Oh, it looks like you've got a horse there that
Yeah,
wants
that's
to add
yeah.
into.
I got Clancy here. Clancy's definitely he's an old soul. He's probably 12, 13. So he's not young, but he's not old, but he's just got a wisdom about him. We're talking about I've just got to share this. My mom passed from a massive stroke in 2013, so 10 years ago. Um, and it went pretty quick. She had the stroke and 9 days later she passed. But there was a hospice care for her. And talk about experts in passing that are just there to preserve a person's dignity and to just it really was probably 9 of the most beautiful days I'd ever spent with my mom, were her last 9. And she could not talk anymore. She could point to things and she could write with her left hand. She was right-handed. Her entire right side had been destroyed by the stroke. But she could write little yes nos and we could still communicate and share. But just the whole hospice experience and that 9 days of passing with dignity was beautiful. But the most beautiful thing was the night she passed. I don't know if it was a full moon or not, but the moon was big and bright. It may have been a day or two from a full moon, or anyhow, it was a moonlit night, and I was working at a rescue out in Loma, Colorado, and we had a sorrel Mustang that he didn't like anybody but me, and I don't think anybody liked him but me, and we just were kind of buddies, kind of kindred souls, and I just couldn't sleep. I was tossing and turning, whole grief process, and I got up out of bed and I put my boots on. I'm out there in pajamas and got my stocking cap on. And I probably just, people would have laughed at how I was dressed, but it was 1 in the morning and out in the middle of nowhere. And I didn't care. I was warm and went out and just spent some time with Monty. And he came in and it was that same story. He put his head on my chest. And he just kept it there. And I knew my mom was within him, comforting me. And again, it was another one of those things. And it was like I don't know how much time passed, but he lifted up his head. He did one of those big horsey stretches and gave out this huge exhale. And I look up at the moon and there's geese flying across the moon. And growing up, we always had geese in the cornfields. And so that brought back a memory to back in the 70s. And so it's just another one of those reassurances that death is just a new beginning. And it's just a new beginning. It can be a hard new beginning for those that are left behind, but it's a new beginning.
Thank you, George.
Linda, I'd like to share a brief story.
If you can, yes, absolutely.
We do an activity at the recovery center where it's three cones, and we do positive, negative, positive.
Mhm.
And the client walks with the horse. And so this was the client's very first equine experience. And even though I tell them to make it spontaneous, he'd already thought what he was going to say. And so he did positive, and then the negative was being with his father for 2 days when the father died. And of course, everybody was sympathetic. And then he walked forward and all of a sudden got a strange look on his face. And he began to tear up, and he got to the third. And he said, this isn't what I was going to say. He said, my positive experience is being there with my father and being able to be there for 2 days while he died. And later he told the clients when he was leaving that that is when he reconnected to his higher self. And I said, you did it at that third cone, didn't you? And he said, yes, I did. And he came to me that day and he said, thank you so much for this experience. I thought we were just coming down here to pet horses.
Oh, isn't that the story so many times? Oh,
And
thank you for sharing that.
it really
Wow.
changed his life. And,
Yeah.
you know, we think we have to do these things, but really, really the universe does them.
Who does it for us? Absolutely. And that those days spent, I wouldn't trade them for the world. Yeah,
Exactly.
that's where it's like we're forced into those. And I mean, forced, beautifully forced, but you know, it's happening. I mean, my father was 2 weeks, but we got to spend those 2 weeks. So you're pushed into it. You don't generally willingly, you know, go there, but when you do go there, it's beautiful. And the grief is in those moments. I'm not sure about others, but I know we did the grieving in that time. When my father finally did pass, there wasn't any more grief.
Right.
It was done, and it was, you know, it was okay. And then you dealt with your own stuff. It was, yeah, I wouldn't trade those. They were beautiful. They were absolutely beautiful.
Instead of the grief, I was able to go to the gratitude quicker because I had
100%. Yeah, absolutely. And I think in some instances, one and the same. When we come at it with heart, that grief and gratitude are side by side. So
interwoven.
Thank you for sharing that, Pam. That's very beautiful. So I'd like to just slowly bring this to a wrap around. But I'd love to ask each of you, there are panelists here, for 2 pieces of wisdom, but wisdom that comes from the horses that really would help enhance our human experience. You've given us so much today already, but we've spoken a bit of really how society deals with and sees the experience of death and the experience of grief. But what can the horses, what can the horses do or teach us that their model of tending towards these things, help us enhance that experience as a society, as an individual or as a society? So yeah, we'll do 2 each maybe. And I'll let anybody jump in that feels they have them.
Well, one, I think, Linda, you just hit on it when you were talking about your father, and maybe we don't want for those moments to happen, right? Or those experiences to happen. We don't, none of us are wishing for death to happen, but that spirit of being present with what is and allowing what is, some of that comes with making our peace with a lot of things, before we get to that point. That's our work to do, and our work to do in relationships. But horses, and I think most of the natural world, we tend to fight with reality. Like I said, we are all going to die, right? Like someone once told me that the day we're born, we start the death process, right? Like that's a crazy thing to think about, but every day we don't know how long any of us have. Every day is a day closer. And just the beauty of, I've had that same experience the times that I have been able to walk beside my horses, and it feels like we're walking each other home. They're teaching me so much about how to hopefully die with grace. from them. Even as I was walking beside them, they were walking beside me already, and they'll be walking beside me. I know that when I do, those experiences will be in my mind and in my heart. And so, yeah, one is just we're walking each other home, and that if we can, the more present we can be and not resisting what's happening, so that we can stay present. The opportunities for beauty at that time are profound.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love that, walking each other home.
I love
Greta.
that. Yeah, if I would say like to be willing to stay embodied, like to be willing to feel the process, whether it's our own death and dying and whatever that means, again, without any judgment of anyone's decision of how they make a choice when they have that option. But I think with the horses, that comes through so clearly. Having also, like, when I lived in the US, euthanasia, as Kim mentioned, was such a practical decision, so quickly within reach, that it was just something, in my experience in the equine industry, that was there and always showed up without a process or a space to actually feel in your own bodies what the horse could be feeling or what the herd could be feeling. And now, living with the herd, like every death and every dying journey, I check, like I have feeling in my body of what is passing through the herd. And that's how I also am in relationship with death now, kind of in all dimensions of my life. And that came for me from the horses, like, because again, as George so beautifully shared, like the exchange and the blending that occurs between us energetically, it's happening, but we have to be present for it. And so, and when we're present for it, then I think we can touch the love that's within the grief. And that can overwhelm us. I have my aunt, she worked in hospice doing Reiki, actually, on hospice patients for 11 years. So she was with people energetically as they passed. And she says, without a doubt, it changed her and it made her love more. And so I think that, like, being energetically in our bodies with death and dying and grief gives us that flow into the love that's within it, because we don't grieve something we don't love. Like, everything we grieve, we love. That's why we're grieving. Yeah.
So true. So true. Thank you. George.
Yeah, and I think that whole the grief and the love, but there is that blend between grief and gratitude, and they can go. I mean, it's literally spiraled like a DNA molecule, where it's you can grieve and be grateful at the same time, and it's just that gratitude. The gratitude, if you can approach grief with gratitude, I think the grief, like both everyone has said, it allows grief to flow. When you approach grief with anxiety or anger, or name the negative emotion,
Yeah.
it hangs on and it just won't let go, and it doesn't seem to, it's like the difference between, well, I don't know, it's just doesn't pass. It just gets stuck, and the grief gets stuck in the body, and then you put it away in a corner, and it just festers and it grows, and then and it's just not a healthy way to grieve when you've got negative emotions with the grief.
Mm-hmm.
When you bring gratitude to the grief, to be grateful for the experiences you've had with that horse, or your parents, or your brother or sister, or whoever, whatever significant being it was in your life, that now that they passed on, when you bring gratitude grief, it just allows grief to flow in a healthy way. And Kim was talking about how horses seem to have ability to cross over and cross back. And this is Tehote, and she's named after a Shoshone horse that could cross over between the dimensions, between death and life and back and forth, and could also come in human form and then back to horse form. And it's one of the most intriguing stories of the Tehote, and she is the reason I'm here. I don't think I'd be here without her. I really don't. I mean, I built the ranch for her.
Yeah.
And there's a really good book called Spirit Horses by Alan S. Evans, Alan Evans, I can't remember his middle initial, but Spirit Horses, and picture of a lake and a mountain on the cover, but highly recommend it. It's available on Kindle and audiobook and hardcover too.
Okay.
It's a really good, it's fictional, but it's a great read.
Thank you. We will put that up for sure.
Alan S. Evans.
Yeah, we'll put a link up
Thank
for
you.
that. Yeah, when we write this summary up. I hear of many times where horses have surrounded a horse as it crosses over. And, stood in community, stood holding space, and then go back to grazing. I always amazed, for me, there's a lot about attachment in how the horse, or what we can learn about our own attachments when we watch horses go through that process and move on. If they're in the wild, they move forward, or they move on, and and I think as humans we see that as negative. We have to hold it. If we hold it, that means we love. And we hold that, and learning how to love and hold that love in a different way, without the attachment. And like I say, I've just heard so many accounts of horses holding space, holding circles around a horse that's dying, and it's just remarkable. And Greta, you talked about the one that held hospice for that other. But when the horse had passed, I would have, did they go back with the herd? And
Yeah. And actually it was even 3 days before he reintegrated with the herd right before Harimau passed. And so, yeah, it was very much that awareness and then the energy of the herd regrounded, because Harimau died of old age. When Picante died, even though he was old, he died from an accident. So the herd was ungrounded, I found. But then again, with time, they reestablished the grounding. And it is, as you share, and in my experience too, there is that the presence is profound and intentional, and there is also the distance doesn't mean there's not connection and love. Yeah.
Well, and as you've all said, it's integrated. It becomes integrated with all the other horses and filling spaces and that interconnectedness. So it's on a deeper level. It almost brings it to a deeper level.
With my herd, with both passings, and again, this isn't a natural herd, and they were small herds. So when you have a small herd and then you have a loss, it's profound. So maybe even more profound energetically, the loss, because it was not a big herd to begin with. But and I don't know whether it's a grieving or an honoring. It kind of felt both. And we have our, limited language and words that we use, but in both instances, mine are both buried in a certain area in the pasture, and the rest of the herd for usually about 2 weeks for my herd of portion of each day standing facing the graves together, and sleeping a lot more than usual, being much much tighter together, a lot less of the, squabbles or conversations, just a very reverent feeling in the herd for week to 2 weeks after. And they kind of immediately fell into whatever, almost like a interim, this is our coping reorganization. And then over the months, a new way that the herd organized and related evolved, but they didn't feel like they needed to sort that out immediately. There was just this we're just coming together in reverence initially, and then be here for each other, and then we will sort the rest out after. That's been my experience with my small herd.
Not a rush to
No.
bring it back to what it was. Yeah, interesting. Huh. So much to talk about. So much wisdom that the natural and the horses for us, that natural world has for us, that we can apply personally or as a society. My heart feels like it's time to wrap up. I'd love to go around and just see if there's any final words from anybody. George, start with you. Any final words?
I think the one thing I keep getting over and over and over again from this herd, and especially this decade, has been so many upheavals and everything. I think the message I get from this herd over and over again is don't stop living if you're afraid of dying. And a lot of people with COVID and the lockdowns and the wars, and there's just something, it's like, live. It's a gift and a blessing. Death will come in its time. Don't die prematurely and keep on breathing.
Yeah.
Just live.
Yeah.
Experience this life. I mean, we are in one of the universe's greatest playgrounds.
Yeah.
So we may as well get out there and enjoy it.
Mhm.
And maybe it's just in your backyard. Maybe it's just with your dogs, or maybe it's just with your horse or your children or your parents or your whatever.
Yeah.
It's an adventure. Live while you still can.
Such a good
This is
point.
your chapter. Let's write a good one.
Write your book. Yeah.
Yeah.
I had to learn that one when my father passed, because he was the last of a generation. That was a tough one, knowing that whole generation had gone.
Yeah.
And that just what you say took a lot of time.
My dad was the same at 92. He says, I outlived everybody I knew as a child.
Yeah.
Yeah. He would have been the lone survivor at a high school reunion.
Oh, really? Wow. Yeah.
If he would have gone, he would have been the only one to show up.
Wow.
So, yeah.
So that's thank you. That's wow.
Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you to
Live.
the horses. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Greta.
Yeah, I would say be willing, and this is an invitation that I walk with every day of my life, but be willing to be present for death, for our own death that's coming and the possibility of it, and that it could be maybe we die of old age and maybe we die in an accident, the uncertainty and the unknown aspect of it. But also, like with the horses, that's so, when you are present with death, then there can be that acknowledgement of what's come to pass. And that's why I've never witnessed a horse whinny and mourn, like whinny looking in the distance for a horse that they've witnessed die. I've never seen that. And I've seen a lot of horses do that when they're separated and sold, and a close companion has been sold, and there's no way of knowing what's happened. Whereas when the herd, in my experience, has been with a herd member and knows that it's dead, then there's not that calling forward. And I feel that we also have that capacity when we're present with our own death and with our loved ones that are dying or dead.
Calling forward. I love that phrase. Wow. Kim, that sort of ties in, I think, to your to Markus, doesn't it?
Mhm.
That sadness. And what did we lose, Kim?
No, I'm here.
Oh, there you are. Okay. Oh, there you are. Sorry, right in front of me.
Just sitting with all that, so beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I also have not heard horses whinny with a death, but definitely with a separation. I do know someone who told me about one that did, and interesting, that horse was alone after so there wasn't a herd there. So maybe no way to know how to process that, like alone, or that's very hard. Yeah, I don't have a lot to add. Being present with the death, with the process, and with the grief afterwards. You're going to share the video of the conversation we had after Shoki's death, and Markus before his death, a year before his death. He was the one that showed me to take my time before I buried Shoki. I love the experience, Greta, you talked about, of actually digging a grave. We had them dug, but he was the one that wouldn't leave Shoki's side, and I didn't understand it until I finally realized he was waiting for me to go back because I wasn't finished with my goodbyes, and he was holding space for me to finish. So that when Markus passed, I gave myself full permission to spend as much time as I needed with him before I buried him. There's so much we rush through, so much we just want to get it hidden or finished or put away. So just that permission to be present with the process. Yeah.
And there's some it's a paragraph or something on, I've seen it, but it basically speaks that when somebody passes, don't rush. No, just be with them. Okay, I've held it together. Let's just take a moment. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for your wisdom.
Thank
I
you.
think if we can take all a moment and just have gratitude. Those that have passed, the horses that shared their wisdom with us. Those beautiful round rainbows. And gratitude for our hackers that we got rid of, because we ended up with this beautiful conversation. So I'm just going to send them a little bit of love now. This is how we need to work.
Yeah.
Thank you all for being here for episode 5. Oh, my heart is full. Just present, and it's full. It's full of gratitude and love and compassion.
And thank you for hosting, Linda, and for bringing us
Yes.
for this conversation.
Yes, Linda, thank you for doing this. It's beautiful.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Thank you.
And if you want to stay for a little bit, that's fine. For those that are listening to us, thank you for listening to this and watching this video in the future from now. But it's all present, let's just say. And episode 6 will come up on March 21st. And we have a lovely lady that is all about intuition, and her story is just beautiful. So thank you all, and take care.
Thank you so much.